I learned how to take all of reality and put it into visceral concepts that we can understand in everyday language. So mathematics is wonderful, but it's not necessary to understand the theory if you can understand what a fluid is, which is like water, air, vapor. Plasma is a fluid. It's just made of split up molecules, but it's still a fluid of these, what I'll call for now particles, but they're really not particles. And so when you understand that the universe is a fluid, you go, oh, really? Well, if it's a fluid, then what's its viscosity? Water is defined by its viscosity and its density and, its thixotropic properties. So what does your universe have? It has a fluid of zero density and zero viscosity, and if you put the most infinitesimal perturbation in it, it will have infinite turbulence. And this fluid, when quiescent, was called the Great Void. But the Great Void is very unstable because it doesn't take much energy to make it turn into infinite turbulence. So we're living in infinite turbulence right now, but there's order to it. It has curved flow patterns. That's the main thing. You could have straight flow patterns, but since everything is turbulent, you're going to always run into something, so you're going to want to curve to get around it. So everything's curving. And you notice that in all fluids. Incense usually goes up in a spiral. Everything flows in spirals. It happens to be related to the golden spiral, by the way. Well, this beautiful universe made of this zero viscosity, zero density fluid that's infinite turbulence, now I've defined the fluid of the universe. And this fluid is starting to get more real now because we call it the zero-point field. In fact, scientists have been calling it that for decades. And I'm just telling you what it is from using a chemical engineer's language of viscosity, density, and things that you can measure in the laboratory, right? And viscosity is just how thick it is. For example, water is more viscous than alcohol, meaning that it takes more energy for you to make your hand go through it back and forth. And honey is really, really viscous. And so that's viscosity. And then density is just how heavy 1 gram is. Well, anyway, so this zero-point field made out of infinitely turbulent void fluid, I call this moving void fluid that other people call zero-point field, I call it the ether. And the ether flows, but what the ether really is the void, which is that base fluid, that's what's flowing. And as it's flowing and turbulent, we call it the zero-point field. But the actual fluid that flows, that is the fluid alone, it's not the fluid with its movement. The fluid with its movement is called the zero-point field. But the fluid itself is called the ether. Just like water itself is called water, but when you have water flowing in patterns, it's called the ocean or the river, you see. So the zero-point field is the ocean that we live in with all its patterns. And one of the patterns in the size scale that we occupy, this size scale, but it's pretty small as an electron, but it's still in our realm of being able to measure it and see it. That electron is the ether flowing in what looks to us like a toroid. But in order to understand the flow pattern of this toroid and to mathematically model it, you would need to know how did it get into that shape. I mean, that's one way to know it. I mean, because you can't really slice it, because then it would dissipate, because it's just flow. You can't like slice a tornado in half and expect it to stay in its flowing pattern, right? And even if it did, you couldn't tell what the velocity was at the time you sliced it. So the only way you can do it is to either videotape it, fill it with dust and videotape it. And sometimes when I talk about the ether, I talk about fairy dust, which is the little swirls inside the bigger swirls, and those are like dust in a tornado, right? And I talk about them like fairy dust because it's an imaginary particle that's really just another toroid of ether at a smaller scale, but it's ultimately fluid at the smallest scale. Well, this, I call it fairy dust, because these little tiny things in the 0-point field, if you could put little dots on them and photograph them, they would swirl around in bigger tornadoes, just like dust swirls around in a tornado that we see on this size scale. So down at that size scale, you have a tornado that forms, which is actually what I call a light wave or a photon, particular type of tornado. It has generally a spiral nature, and as it forms, it has to go somewhere, because the outer stuff makes it go inward, but it can't keep going inward in the same plane, so it shoots out in opposite directions, and then two equal and opposite photons are made, which are like mirror image tornadoes of each other in the ether, which is a fluid that it flows through. And it's sort of a self-propelling thing, but I spent a long time, like a whole year, getting the equations to understand how the photon flow pattern is, and I look forward to talking about that. But right now, if we understand that light is a tornado in the 0-point field, and then if you warp space-time enough, we're sort of borrowing from current physics language, and then I'll convert it to my language. But warped space-time, you know what that is, right? Planets bend gravity and stuff. That's because planets suck in ether. Well, anyway, if you do something to a photon that's flowing in a straight line to where warped space-time makes it bend in on itself, and it's like an Ouroboros snake eating its tail, then its head swallows its tail, and it becomes sort of a stable thing that just keeps flowing in the circle over and over and over, because it keeps sucking its own tail in, and it's self-sustaining, so it goes around forever, and it's sucking in space from outside. And then, as a side note, there's an equal and opposite flow of space, or of the 0-point field, outward. So the inward flow into mass has to be balanced by outward flow of the 0-point field going outward. So that explains dark energy and expanding universe. Like I said, that was in the side, and there's like a whole chapter on that. So, by using the terms of chemical engineering to describe subatomic physics, I think it gives us a way to understand really what's going on, and if everybody can understand what gravity is, then we can either know, oh, we know what gravity is. So now we either can or can't make anti-gravity machines. But you can't make an anti-gravity machine unless you know how it works. That's a given. Now, if you know how gravity works, it doesn't mean you can invent an anti-gravity machine. It just means you know whether you can or not, okay? Next video, I'm going to tell you how gravity works. Light is, as I said before, is a tornado of the ether, or the 0-point field, that flows inward into the tornado spirally, and then out what I call the tip. And that flow comes from infinity out there and inward into the photon. And so you can see from my description, bear with me, that inward flow is what gravity is. Because gravity is the acceleration of ether through our bodies into the earth. Because the mass of the earth is collectively sucking in the 0-point field, just like light does. And just like tornadoes do, they suck in the air around them. So gravity is that. And not only does light pull in space, but since light is formed into a toroid to make matter, such as an electron, it's condensed. And so therefore it makes a lot more concentration of localized sucking in of the ether, or sucking into the 0-point field. And it accelerates inwardly. An acceleration of ether going into light, and then in a more concentrated manner into the toroid, which is made of the light. It's concentrated into a circle. Because light, you see, is spread out over infinite distance in a straight line. But when light is trapped in its own gravitational field, it's all concentrated to what seems to us like a point, but it's an electron. And what we need to know is that electrons and black holes both have the similar flow patterns in terms of quality of the flow pattern. And it looks more like a toroid, and there's a spirality to it, okay? And I have some bagels with arrows on them that show the direction of flow. and you could open the slice of the bagel and you could see, you know, a certain, is it going clockwise inward or counterclockwise inward? And so that's how I characterize electrons versus positrons, but that's a whole nother lecture. So right now we're just talking about what is gravity. So now that we know that gravity is inwardly accelerating ether, which is a form of warped space-time, but my language is more clear and it helps you see it as a fluid. Since we know that, and we know that matter is condensed light, and we know how light condenses to make the matter, the tornadic form of light forms a spiral toroid to make the matter. And again, matter is not a particle, it's just flowing ether in sort of in a certain form. Have you ever seen a dolphin make a bubble ring? Here's the dolphin, and he makes a little bubble ring like that. I don't know if you can see that on this dark video. And the bubble ring that it makes is just a big ring, right? Because they make like a little tornado in the water filled with air, and it's twisted, you know, and then its tip meets its tail and it kind of latches together, and it makes this big bubble ring that sort of hangs around in the water for like a whole minute. Perfect example of the quality of the flow directions of matter, of light going to matter, is the little funnel they make going into a ring. And when I first saw that, you know, I was developing my theory and I was like, yes, this is the perfect example. So, you know, the universe has given me this wonderful example to help explain all of this. I did talk about expanding space. Let me just talk about dark matter. We understand that a light wave is a tornado of a certain size scale that's condensed into a toroid of a certain size scale, which we call an electron, for an example. And this type of phenomenon occurs on all size scales. Like the bigger size scale would be, we're all familiar with the black hole. And a lot of people draw these black holes with this beam of energy going in and out. But all that is that the big toroid, the way the etheric flux acceleration pattern is making that toroid, causes a lot of the fairy dust particles going in it to be concentrated at that, like, if this is the toroid, or this is the sphere they draw, and then they have a thing going up and thing going down, going into it, and the top one is going out. And this is the donut, and this is just one edge of it, and I'm coming at you. Can you see that if this is the center, that it's going upwards? Every time it comes into the center, it goes up. Into the center, it goes up. So that's where the extra fairy dust would exit. And then the fairy dust on the other side would be going in, you know, the same direction. So it would go in. And so that's why there's those two columns. But it's not a sphere, it's a donut, a toroid. And the part of that flow pattern of that toroid are those two columns. If what I'm saying is basically the same as what other physicists are saying, that's awesome, because it just means that I thought of it independently and from the viewpoint of a chemical engineer, and I came to the same conclusion. That would be the best outcome possible. But one thing that I do know for sure, though, is that when I calculated the diameter of that electron, that would be what Wheeler called the geon, and I was told this after I showed my calculations to a professor at Georgia Tech, Dr. Finkelstein. He told me that Wheeler already had done that, and he called it a geon. He said it was really gigantic and big. But my calculations show that it was a stable gamma ray that got, when the Big Bang formed or whatever, when there was a lot of high energy and warped space-time formed, there was enough warped space-time in that small size range to force the light to go into a little tiny circle. And it was a gamma wave that was the starting material. So that's what makes our electrons super high energy gamma waves. Now, the diameter that I calculated was the exact same diameter as somebody that calculated the diameter of a superstring, like one of the most fundamental resonant harmonies of the superstring, or string theory. And, you know, it was like 2 Planck's length, some simple thing. I'll show it here. But anyway, my calculation was exactly the same thing, and I was like, well, but I know they weren't even thinking about ether. They were talking about strings and like jump rope wiggles and things. Nothing to do with ether, which is a fluid. So I thought that was pretty cool that my viewpoint coming from fluid and their viewpoint coming from strings and wiggly lines, you know, resonance, gave the same diameter. So, and what they're calling a string, I call an electron. I will now shift into a different video where I go into the details. Peace, everyone.